So what are the chances of getting on in life? Do they depend on who your mum and dad are, where you live, where you come from, or how much hard work and talent that you have? If you're interested in that question, then you're going to be interested in the topic of social mobility. And what we mean by social mobility is your chances of climbing the social ladder, the chances of doing well in life. And over the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to talk to you and introduce you to this amazing topic that I'm a passionate expert in. And I want to start with this first slide, which is a very stark image of a very unequal playing field. And the reason I've done that is that the debates about social mobility really are about this notion of a playing field. How fair is society? And it's my view that we actually live in a very unequal society, and that's shown by this unlevel playing field. Of course, it would be probably an empty stadium, wouldn't it, in the pandemic era? But my view is that we're so unequal that those people at the bottom of the social ladder are struggling to climb up the ladder. And the central question beneath this debate, I think, is to what extent we allow freedom for parents to invest in their children's futures against this other competing need in society to do the best for those from all backgrounds, particularly those from poorer backgrounds. So I want you to think about that question as I go through the slides. I am Lee Elliot Major. I'm the first professor of social mobility in the country, and I'm a professor of practice here at the University of Exeter. And what that means is I do lots of research, teaching of students and trainee teachers, but I'm also interested in impact on the real world. So I work with governments, I work with teachers, I work with young people to try and improve the prospects of social mobility in society. And I am myself a product, if you like, of social mobility. I'm the first person in my family to go to university, and I lived on my own when I was 15 and left school, went back to school. So this is very much a personal passion as well as a professional passion. So I want to cover three main topics today, and the first really is around the fact that we think the research shows, and I hope I'm not going to be too depressing here today, that social mobility has declined in this country. So the chances of doing well in life have declined for the current generation. I'm also going to talk about this link between inequality and social mobility. So a lot of the public debates about this talk about both the gaps between people from richer and poorer backgrounds, but also the chances of climbing the social ladder. And then I'm going to talk about education. Education, we hope, is going to be this great social leveller that levels up opportunities, but I'm going to explain why education systems struggle to do that. So those are the three things I'm going to talk about. So the social mobility decline. So what we know is that every generation since the World War II, since the war, have done better than the previous one. So if you measure, for example, average earnings for each generation since the war, in real terms, that's so that taking into consideration the costs of inflation, did better than their parents' generation. Apart from one generation, and that's the generation growing up now. It's probably you listening to this now. And what we know is, on average, the earnings of young people today are less than their parents were a generation before. And that's an important fact, because I think that is why we have all these debates about fairness and a lack of opportunity in society. And it's why we need to address these issues. This is one slide that just shows the post-war trends over the last sort of 80 years. And I won't go into each era in detail because I don't have time, but really the point here is that there was this golden age of social mobility immediately after the war, and that was because the economy and society was expanding and new jobs were emerging. The sociologists would say there's more room at the top, there was more jobs being created. And as I said, we're now in this era, since the big recession in 2008, of declining opportunity. Now, that doesn't mean you can't get on in life. It just means that, for example, getting a house as a young person, getting on the social ladder or the housing ladder is more difficult. But it still means that you can get on in life. And this was really before the pandemic. And I'm going to talk a bit about what's happened later, about what's happened during the pandemic. And this is a graph just showing what I was talking about earlier, this decline in average earnings. So what we see is, so this is the proportion of young people growing up who are earning more than or equal to their parents. And what you see after 2007, that slowly, it's a sharp decline in the proportion of children growing up as adults who are earning as much as their parents. I suspect that will decline further after the pandemic. So the second main finding from the social mobility research that I've been involved with and others is this link between inequality and immobility. Immobility is the lack of social mobility. And what we know is, and the following slide really sums it up neatly for me, and this is a bunch of developed nations that we've got data for, and what we're doing here is we're measuring how unequal they are. So the further to the right of that graph, the more unequal the nations are, so the bigger the gaps between rich and poor. And the higher up on that graph, the less mobile those nations are, okay? And what you find is, if you look, Great Britain and the United States, the land of the American dream, supposedly, we are the most unequal nations, but also the least mobile. And there's lots of debate about this because this is a correlation, okay? This is not proving there is a cause between unequal outcomes in society and less mobility. It's showing that these two things are somehow linked. But I would argue that there are compelling reasons why, if you have stark inequalities, particularly in early life, that leads to wider outcomes in later life. So I think any politician who's serious about social mobility, in my view, needs to be thinking about redistribution and inequality. I still think you need to think about social mobility as well, because who is at the top of society is important for all of us. So a lot of my work is about campaigning to have more diversity at the very top of our society, whether it's politicians or lawyers or whatever industry we're talking about. And it's really important that I think we have people at the top of society that are serving the wider population, that are representative of the wider population. So we know that these two things are linked, inequality and social mobility. So education, the great social leveller. So there's a lovely graph that I use for my lecture, and this is it. This is about 100 years old, this picture, and it's an advert. It's an American college, and it really, I love it because it really conceptualizes this idea of education being the sort of great escalator. So this is a sort of sliding doors moment. I don't know if you remember that film, Sliding Doors, where you make one choice, and that really affects what happens in your future life. And the advert is cleverly sort of showing this young man who, if he goes to college, he ends up being happier and earns more, and if he doesn't, then he increasingly sort of feels sad and increasingly morose. I almost feel sorry for that last picture there at the end. Now, of course, education and going to university and school is important. It can be transformative, but what we find is that the education system isn't the great social leveller that we would all wish for. And the reason for this is that those families who do have the resources, the middle classes, to invest in their children are doing so ever more. And over the last few decades, we've documented this, and this is one graph that just shows the extent of private tutoring outside school. And this has boomed over the last 2 decades. And in places like London, I think it's like 40% now of 11 to 16-year-olds have some form of private tutoring outside schools. And the reason this is interesting from a social mobility perspective is that if you happen to be from a family that doesn't have those resources, then you're going to be left behind in this, what we call the education arms race. So even though schools and universities are doing a lot to try and counter the inequalities outside, they're up against this, what I call the education arms race. And the research I've been involved in during the pandemic over the last year and a half has shown that inequalities in education have been exacerbated and exposed by that crisis. And this slide just shows the differences in likelihood of benefiting from a full school day during all those school closures that have happened during the pandemic. And what we found was that those from private schools were twice as likely to have benefited from a full school day compared to their state school counterparts. So these are really profound losses during the pandemic. And this graph just shows you where we are in terms of what we call the achievement gap. So every year, myself and colleagues document the gap between pupils from poorer backgrounds and the rest of pupils in schools. What GCSEs are they getting, and what is the gap between that? Now, there's always been a gap between pupils from poor backgrounds and their richer counterparts. But what we're seeing here, so this is the extent of the gap. You see over the last decade, that gap was starting to come down. But over the last year, we've seen that gap reverse. We've seen all those gains over the last decade. I told you I was going to depress you, that they have been reversed. So we are really facing huge challenges in the post-pandemic world, and I and others have been involved in championing for extra investment in education and talking to the government about what they should do in terms of the recovery post-pandemic. The other thing that's happening in education, and I think this is happening in schools and universities, is they are shouldering, in my view, wider and wider responsibilities. So when I visit schools and universities, what you're finding is that they're effectively acting like social welfare institutions as much as centres for learning. And I think this is one of the big debates that I'm interested in, and I'm always talking to young people about their experiences here as well. I think we need a national debate about what is the role of education and how far is responsibility for teachers to look after children in all sorts of other ways, as well as teaching them in the classroom. So the other thing I wanted to talk about was variations in social mobility, and I wanted to mention a couple of other important findings that my work has produced. And this is really what we call the bottom end of social. What happens to children who come out of school without basic maths or English, who have essentially failed their GCSEs. And what we find is, I call it lost souls, because I feel like the education system is failing these young people. And what we find is, it always surprises people, about 25% of pupils leave school without basic maths and literacy, which I think is a national scandal. When you look at the international comparisons, again, it's only the US that do worse than us on this. So I think that's a big challenge and something that we need to address if we're going to address issues of national social mobility. At the other end of the spectrum, at the very top, and I sort of mentioned this earlier, we see that those from private schools dominate those people in high positions in society. Private schools make up about 7% of all schools, but what we find is about 50% of leaders in politics, the media and other industries are from those schools. And a lot of my work is really saying, well, look, we're missing out basically on a lot of that 93% of state school students who should, if they want to go into those industries, consider that sort of career. You know, my definition of social mobility in many ways has changed over the years, and what I would say is it's about the fact that background shouldn't determine what you want to do in your life, right? Now that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether you want to be a top lawyer or stay in your locality and be a teacher or whatever it is, but your background shouldn't determine that. It should be down to your hard work and effort. So another project I'm involved in is looking at the Southwest in particular, because what we're realising in this research now is, so we've done a lot of international comparisons, which I showed you earlier, looking at the social mobility levels of different countries. But what we're also finding is that social mobility varies by place, by town, by county, by region in the UK. So one of the research projects I'm doing at the moment is looking at what are the particular challenges of social mobility in the southwest of the country, and we're producing a regional sort of report to look at those issues. And what we're finding apart from everything else, is that the Southwest suffers from a particular issue around disconnectivity. So we need better connectivity, whether it's the roads in Devon or whether it's actually internet access for young people that live across a big region that has lots of rural and coastal areas. So I'm talking to government about this, and I'm arguing that we actually need a regional strategy for every part of our country to address social mobility if we're serious about it. A lot of government is talking about levelling up at the moment, which I think is a similar sort of idea. How do we enable people, wherever they live, to have opportunities in life? So finally, as I said, I'm a professor of practice, so I'm interested in research and teaching, but I'm also interested in how do we actually improve prospects for young people, particularly in our country and indeed elsewhere. So I'm constantly engaged with government on this, and I just thought I'd sort of explain a few of the things that I'm involved in. I'm helping the university, by the way, in terms of its own access efforts, in terms of recruiting students from all backgrounds, and I think we're becoming a far more welcoming institution in terms of young people from all backgrounds. But in terms of national debates, what I've been looking at is actually the other half of young people that don't go to university. And there's lots of debates about this, and I think we need more support and government grants for those young people who do apprenticeships, who go straight into work. So that's one of the big debates about social mobility. The other half, what happens to the half of young people that don't go to university? There's big issues about the workplace, and many of you will have recognised this. I think there's a real issue around basic conditions that everyone should have. We had a big debate in this country 20 years ago about having a minimum wage, and I'm glad that we now do have a minimum salary. But I think we now need a debate about minimum conditions. So that means, what are the basic entitlements that all people should have, irrespective of what job they do? So I'm very much involved in that, and I think all jobs should have some progression in them. So when you start a job, what is the progression within that company or workplace that you are in? And then finally, another thing that I'm involved in is I talk to lots of big employers about their own diversity efforts. So most of the major employers now in this country will have what they call diversity and inclusion strategies. And the thing that I'm pushing them on at the moment is that they are focusing on gender and ethnicity and other characteristics, which I think are all really important. But the one thing that they're missing out on at the moment is social class, is actually how to attract and develop people, particularly those from sort of working class backgrounds. So social class alongside these other characteristics, I think, is a really important thing. So in summing up, I've tried to give you some main facts of social mobility research and outline some of the challenges. I just want to end on a more positive note, because there is a tendency, and I said earlier I didn't want to depress you, but I think there is a chance now in a post-pandemic era to actually address some of these profound issues. I really believe we're at a moment in history where if we group together and we think radically, we can change some of these profound inequalities that have been affecting society for so long. And I'm involved with government and others in trying to do that. I actually think a lot of this comes down to the young people that are growing up now, many of whom are students. And I really I engage with students a lot, and I encourage them to challenge governments and actually some of the sort of assumptions about society that we have. So I think we are at a moment where we can change these issues. I just quote Roosevelt there from the American sort of Deep Depression, because America really recovered amazingly well during that era. And then finally, there are many books I've written about this that please do go and get, available in all good bookstores. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you in Exeter sometime soon.